HIV vaccine trials begin in South Africa ahead of World AIDS Day. As U.S. President-elect Donald Trump embarks on a thank you tour, good news for workers at the Carrier air conditioner plant in Indiana. And vintage planes cross the continent to raise awareness of wildlife conservation. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Heidi Adams-Fitzpatrick. This is Africa 54. Thank you so much for joining us. It's December 1st, World AIDS Day, and we begin tonight with Africa 54's health correspondent, Lenore Madu. Lenore, good evening to you.
Hello, Eddie. And on this day each year, World AIDS Day, this is our people worldwide unite in the fight against HIV and show their support for people living with HIV and commemorate people who have died. This year's theme is Hands Up for HIV Prevention. The campaign looks at ways to improve prevention strategies, especially for people who are vulnerable to transmission, adolescent girls and young women in particular. In a report released recently, UNAIDS says 18.2 million people are now on antiretroviral therapy. However, women between 15 and 24 years of age are at great risk of infection. An estimated 34 million people have the HIV virus globally. More than 35 million people have died of the disease since it was first identified in 1984. Over the years, scientific advances have improved prevention, treatment, and living with the virus. But many agree more remains to be done. Now joining us live via Skype from Baltimore, Maryland is Dr. Chris Berer, Desmond M. Tutu Professor of Public Health and Human Rights, Associate Director of Johns Hopkins University Center for AIDS Research, and President of the International AIDS Society. Dr. Berer, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lenore. It's wonderful to be here.
So this year's World AIDS Day looks at prevention, especially with adolescent girls and women. What is your take on the impact of HIV among this particular group?
Well, this is one of the groups that we're the most concerned about, particularly, of course, in Africa, and particularly in southern and eastern Africa, which are the parts of the world where we see predominance, the majority of new infections in adolescent girls and young women. The rates are really very high. South Africa, just as an example, about 1,000 new infections a day still. So we're very concerned about this group, and the good news is that we really do have some new prevention approaches with evidence for efficacy. So there's a lot of reason to be optimistic this year.
So we have reasons to be optimistic, but it is really a reason for concern when we see the rate among young people. Could complacency become the new HIV crisis? I mean, the sense that giving progress, perhaps young women and men are not so worried about HIV that much anymore and do not make the appropriate steps for prevention.
Well, that is a real concern. And one of the things that we're most excited about is that the very good evidence that treatment, effective early treatment of HIV infection, reduces a person's risk of being infectious, of onward transmission. But when we look, for example, at men in their 20s and 30s, we see that a very significant proportion of those men living with HIV are not tested and are not treated. And so because of that, that is bad for their health, but it also means that they continue to be able to spread the virus. So if we want to reduce new infections in women and girls, we really also have to do a much better job of engaging men in HIV testing and treatment. And we have to be smarter about that. We have to reach men where they are, in workplaces, in hours that are convenient for working men, and we have to reach them with things that they're interested in too. So there's very good data, for example, from Kenya and Tanzania that shows if you add screening for hypertension and diabetes, you get a much better buy-in of men agreeing to HIV testing. That's the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that we're going to need to really make a change in this epidemic.
Let's talk about R&D real quick, research and development. You were co-chair for this year's International International AIDS Conference, a gathering where many experts present their work and research. What would you say are some of the latest top breakthroughs in HIV/AIDS research?
Well, I did have the honor of co-chairing the International AIDS Conference in Durban with my friend and colleague, Professor Olive Shisana from South Africa. I think certainly one of the big advances was the data from the HIV vaccine trials, that was HVTN 100, that looked at the immune responses in Africans and showed that they were really very vigorous. That data, which was presented in Durban, led to the decision to go ahead with starting the next efficacy trial, the big phase 3 trial of a new HIV vaccine. That started just a few days ago in South Africa. That's HVTN 702. It's a partnership with the U.S. and South Africa. And very importantly, I think that study is going to look at men and women with heterosexual exposure, over 5,000 of them, with a vaccine that is very much developed based on the subtype of HIV which is circulating in southern Africa. That's the clade C virus. So that's very important as an advance.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Bera. We'd like to end on the note of hope. We thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And that was Professor Chris Bera. He is Associate Director of Johns Hopkins University Center for AIDS Research. Now, for nearly 3 decades, every December 1st, we've heard about the tragedy of AIDS. And it is tragic, of course. The virus has killed tens of millions of people, often in the prime of their lives. And it's left behind millions of orphans. But now, on this World AIDS Day, VOA's Carol Pearson has a message of hope.
A lot has happened since the first World AIDS Day in 1988. Countries where the topic was once taboo now offer testing and treatment. Mothers with HIV can have healthy babies and live to raise them. Drugs can keep the virus from spreading, and now scientists are talking about vaccines and a cure. Researchers are injecting thousands of volunteers in South Africa with a potential vaccine in a trial that just got underway. They are also trying to use the body's own immune system to keep the virus in check. One study conducted by the University of Pennsylvania shows that this may be possible.
We infuse antibodies into the patients, the participants in the study, and we want to see if those antibodies would control the HIV virus, would keep it quiet and prevent the virus from coming back when we stop antiretroviral therapy.
Dr. Pablo Tibas spoke by Skype. The research in controlling HIV with antibodies is similar to the immunotherapy being done in the field of cancer. The technique uses proteins to attack cancer cells. HIV hides in the cells. If a patient stops taking anti-AIDS drugs, the virus comes back.
When you think about oncology and cancer therapy with these immune-based therapies, what people are doing now in that field is to try to boost the immune system to eliminate the cancer cells. The problem of eliminating the HIV hideout is similar. You want to eliminate the cells that harbor the virus, and by making the immune system more active in finding and eliminating those cells.
Researchers have found that the antibodies suppressed the HIV virus for 21 days. The goal is to find a combination of antibodies that can suppress the virus for 6 months to a year. Then people infected with HIV will no longer have to take medicine every day for the rest of their lives. A new trial using 2 antibodies should start in the next couple of months. Carol Pearson, VOA News, Washington.
And that's our health report for today. So stay in touch for more. Find me on Twitter @LenorMoudou. Back to you, Heidi.
Thank you, Lenore, so much for joining us. Be sure to watch Lenore Moudou every Tuesday and Thursday for the latest health news in Africa, right here on Africa 54. to the world of politics now, and Gambians are voting today in one of the country's closest elections in more than 2 decades. And that vote went ahead despite an internet blackout, a protest ban and allegations of vote rigging. President Yahya Jammeh is facing the biggest political challenge of his 22 years in power. He wants a 5th term in office, but he has stiff competition from political newcomer and businessman Adama Barrow, who has the backing of several opposition parties. A third candidate, former ruling party MP Mama Kande, is hoping he'll end Jammeh's rule. Earlier this week, President Jammeh warned there'll be zero tolerance for protests or unrest over the election results. A top opposition politician from Ethiopia's Oromo region has been arrested after he returned from a meeting with members of the European Parliament. Merera Gudina travelled to Brussels, where he reportedly spoke out against Ethiopia's political crisis. Gudina, who leads the Oromo People's Congress, was arrested in his house in Addis Ababa shortly after he returned from Europe. Government officials say Gudina violated an emergency rule by, quote, making contact with terrorist groups. The Oromo region has been at the centre of protests against land grabs and what opponents say is a government crackdown on political freedom. Media reports suggest the United States is trying to secure the minimum number of votes needed for the UN Security Council to impose an arms embargo on South Sudan. The US also wants further targeted sanctions against South Sudan's rebel leader, Army Chief of Staff and Information Minister, who it says are fueling violence and obstructing peace. Now, the UN Commission for Human Rights has warned that ethnic cleansing is taking place in parts of South Sudan, setting the stage for what could be a repeat of Rwanda's 1994 genocide. The Security Council resolution needs 9 votes in favour and no vetoes in order to be adopted. But a senior diplomat speaking on condition of anonymity said so far only 7 members are in favour, while the remaining 8 are planning to either abstain or vote no. Russia and China are sceptical whether an arms embargo would make a difference, saying South Sudan is already awash with weapons. But diplomats don't expect them to actually block the measure should it be put to a vote at the Security Council. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power's term is about to come to an end as the Trump administration prepares to take over here in Washington. Power has had to deal with some of the world's worst conflicts since taking the job in 2013. She spoke to VOA earlier this week after the UN Security Council approved new sanctions against North Korea for its unrelenting pursuit of nuclear weapons. Our report from Zlatica Hoke.
North Korea has been under UN sanctions since 2006 for its illicit nuclear and ballistic missile tests, but it has persisted in building nuclear arms. Power told VOA the new sanctions will close some of the loopholes of the previous ones, but much will depend on how well they are implemented by China, North Korea's main benefactor.
My sense is that they find 2 nuclear tests in a calendar year extremely destabilizing. They see the steps that responsible nations like the United States, Korea, Japan have to take in terms of our deterrence, in terms of military exercise to prepare because of the provocations and the illegal actions of the North Korean regime. And I think they are very sincere in wanting the denuclearization of the peninsula.
During her term as U.S. envoy in the World Organization, Power was involved in seeking solutions for war-torn Syria. The latest UN proposal to create an autonomous zone in rebel-controlled eastern Aleppo has been flatly rejected by the Syrian government, whose forces are now carrying out brutal attacks on the area.
The air attacks by the Syrian regime, aided by the Russian Federation, are going to stain the conscience of those countries who carried them out, stain history, and they will be something that people will speak about generations hence as defining actions by President Assad and by President Putin.
Power said the conflict in Syria can only end through a negotiated process.
They can take a populated area, even one as substantial as eastern Aleppo, inflict horrific human carnage, and the war will not end. If anything, you will have more people who will be eager to take up arms against the regime. What will end the war is a political solution.
Power also has been engaged in UN efforts to end the ethnic violence in South Sudan.
We are urging Security Council members to act quickly to impose an arms embargo in order to change at least one dimension of the South Sudanese government's actions, which is their propensity for choosing arms systems over food for their people.
Power's term as UN ambassador ends early next year when the new Republican administration takes over. Zlatisa Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
So we want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover here. You can join the conversation on Facebook. The address there is Africa 54. And please check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Coming up, could Donald Trump's deal with an Indiana air conditioning manufacturer provide clues to how he'll govern? We'll take a look at that after the break. Stay with us.
Technology, here's what's new.
They're called Rolly blocks, and you make music with them. They're a set of modular controllers that connect to your iPhone or iPad using an app called Noise. The main controller is a 12 by 12 centimeter grid of illuminated squares, each representing a note in the chromatic scale. Express the note depending on how hard and how long you press the square. Press, tap, drag, swirl, slide. All these different motions provide different musical effects from a choice of 128 synthesized instruments in that Noise app. Rolly's Ruben Dax.
It's easy enough for someone who doesn't know anything about music to get right into it, start making music. There's all these tools to help them out, but it's also powerful enough for professionals who are looking for a new way to shape music.
Rolly blocks are selling for $179 at Apple stores or on the Rolly website. For VOA's What's New, I'm Todd Grossans.
Welcome back. We go to South America now, and there's an update on the deadly plane crash in Colombia. There's growing evidence tonight that the plane carrying a Brazilian soccer team had run out of fuel before it crashed, killing 71 people. Aviation officials are now investigating why the plane flew under those conditions. The Bolivian pilot's final words before the plane slammed into a mountain outside Medellin have also been confirmed. The pilot can be heard telling the control tower that the plane was, quote, in total failure without fuel. He requested urgent permission to land shortly after. Audio went silent. Only 6 of the 77 people on board that plane survived. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump kicks off what he calls a thank you tour on Thursday with a campaign-style rally in Cincinnati, Ohio. His first stop, however, will be in Indiana, where he'll tout an agreement reached with air conditioner maker Carrier to keep about 1,000 jobs in that state. In Indiana, Trump and Vice President Mike Pence are due to visit Carrier's plant in Indianapolis and give a more formal announcement of the deal to keep jobs in the Midwestern state instead of moving them to Mexico. Trump transition team member Anthony Scaramucci says this is an example of the president-elect's economic policies at work.
If you keep 1,000 jobs for the Carrier Corporation and you leave them in Indiana, well, that's an increase, or at least not a decrease in your tax base. So the idea here is to use the tax policy to create more middle-class jobs and to create wage growth for the working class. And so the combination of those two things, I think you'll see with dynamic scoring that we should have a revenue neutral, or excuse me, deficit neutral, or possibly even a reduction in the deficit if we handle this properly.
Carrier, which is part of the industrial and military conglomerate United Technologies Corporation, said earlier this year that it was relocating its Indiana operations as a cost-cutting move. The company said in a statement Wednesday that factors in its decision to stay included financial incentives from Indiana and a promise from the incoming Trump administration to create an improved, more competitive U.S. business climate. A policy analyst with the nonprofit group Issue One, Meredith McGee, says the Carrier's decision is good news, but raises questions about the influence of money in public policy.
I think this is actually what happened with Carrier is a perfect demonstration of the, if you will, awesomeness of the power of the presidency, which shows why these steps are unique and why these conflict of interest issues are so important.
Well, neither the company nor Trump has given details such as what threats or specific incentives were used to get Carrier to change its mind, or whether United Technologies will move other jobs from a separate Indianapolis plant to Mexico. Trump may have had some leverage over United Technologies, which also owns a company that supplies fighter jet engines and relies in part on U.S. military contracts. For now, the deal seems to be a win for Trump, who made frequent promises during his election campaign for president that he would prevent companies from moving jobs abroad and bring back jobs that have already been lost by imposing stiff tariffs on the company's products for sale in the United States. Earlier this week, we brought you a story about the shortage of fighter squadrons in the U.S. Air Force. While wars continue abroad, there's a second crisis hitting hard at home: a shortage of mechanics to keep the Air Force planes going. VOA's Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has more.
Motors running. Maintainers keep the Air Force flying high. But recently, their numbers started falling to the tune of about 4,000 airmen short.
There's a strain, for sure.
The workload for a maintainer at Joint Base Langley-Eustis is relentless as they work on the F-22 Raptor jet and the T-38 Talon, a jet that's about 50 years old and needs frequent repairs.
Maybe once a day to once every other day, we'll bring back a jet that has some kind of issue that needs to get fixed by our maintenance before it can get launched back up. So even at night when we're not flying, they're working on the planes and making sure that they're ready to go for the next day.
But despite the lack of manpower, maintainers say they have a job to do.
We all understand that the whole more with less is happening, but I mean, regardless, jets have to fly. So we're going to make it happen. But yeah, there's definitely pain in that process.
I don't have any disagreement.
Back at the Pentagon, officials admit that can-do attitude has so far led to little relief.
We were living, on the edge with our maintainers for a long time. But we were able to accomplish the mission.
Lieutenant General John Cooper, who is in charge of the maintainers, has been managing a shrinking force after a series of shrinking budgets from Congress.
We were driven to the force structure that we're at last year and growing from sequestration. There's no doubt about it. That's in the history books.
Cooper and Major General Scott Vanderham, who's in charge of fixing the fighter pilot shortage, say the Air Force is no longer able to do more with less.
We owe them capacity, more people, and we owe that now as soon as we can.
Because while the maintainers are succeeding in their combat mission abroad, Cooper says the airmen are no longer able to complete their ever-important training mission.
We're paying the prices back home where we have to train our air crew for the high-end fight, for the next fight. So we're taking our lumps at home where we can't produce the sorties because of the manpower.
The Air Force hit a 3,800 maintainer shortage in 2015. A training increase was approved this year that added about 500 maintainers, but there's still a shortage of 3,300. If the Air Force budget doesn't dip, the generals say they'll be out of the maintainer manpower hole by 2021. Reporting at Langley Air Force Base, I'm Carla Babb, VOA News.
Well, it's time now for a short break. Still to come here on Africa 54. Vintage planes take to the African skies, and it's all for a good cause. We'll be right back.
If you've just joined us, I'm Mariama Diallo, and here is a quick recap of today's headlines. In the DRC, tens of thousands of refugees from South Sudan continue to pour into the country as conflict worsens in the greater equatorial region. In the Gambia, voters head to the polls in closely contested presidential election. In South Africa, a UNAIDS report shows that girls between 15 and 19 years old account for 74% of all new infections globally, with 90% in southern Africa. In Mali, the former army captain Amadou Sanogo goes on trial. He's charged with murdering 21 soldiers after staging a military coup in the country in 2012. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Welcome back to Africa 54. Let's take a look at what's trending this Thursday. This is a table football match with a difference. These robots whizzing around the green felt table are competing in the football final of the World Robotics Olympiad on the outskirts of India's capital. WRO is an event for science, technology and education and brings together young people from all over the world to develop their creativity and problem-solving skills through robotics competitions. Participating teams build and pre-program their robots to take part in automation challenges in a number of different categories, including advanced robotics and WRO football. And how about this robot? This four-legged beast is showing off its agility in rocky terrain. The HYQ robot, an acronym for hydraulic quadruped, is the brainchild of researchers at the Italian Institute of Technology's Advanced Robotics Department in Genoa. The HYQ can trot, walk, and rocks and pebbles, climb stairs, walk backwards and keep itself upright if it gets knocked down. These are exactly the qualities a robot needs to be able to navigate challenging, unstable terrain, such as collapsed buildings in the aftermath of an earthquake. More research is needed, however, before HYQ robots are ready to be deployed in the field. And that is what is trending today. Imagine this, vintage planes flying in the skies over 10 African countries. Must be a beautiful sight. Well, that's what you were able to see if you were in Kenya last Sunday. The Vintage Planes Rally is raising funds for UNICEF and BirdLife International to promote wildlife conservation. But it hasn't been all plain sailing. The pilots of the 20 old biplanes have had a spot of trouble. Before reaching Kenya, they were detained in Ethiopia for 2 days because of paperwork problems. Mohammed Yusuf has more from Nairobi.
They're on a mission in the air and on the ground. It is a mission to raise money and awareness for wildlife conservation in Africa. Adam Morant is one of the 20 pilots who landed in Kenya's National Park.
I'm very privileged and happy that I can be that, and hopefully we'll have more of those kind of events that we can make sure that it's aware for the wildlife and the parks and good support for them.
One rally sponsor is BirdLife International, which is hoping to create awareness of the decline of vultures in Africa. The Vintage Air Rally began 2 weeks ago in the Greek island Crete, after landing in Ethiopia, where the 40 crew members were detained for 2 days for allegedly entering its airspace illegally. The rally team made it Kenya, where aviation fans turned out. Organizers of the local event say the historic biplanes from the first half of the 20th century created a lot of buzz and gave a lift to Kenya's tourism.
We were trying to create an opportunity to showcase Kenya's tourism, and to do that you can see the crowds that have turned up. What this will take is take the story to the world. We want Kenya to be seen as a star destination. We want people to come to Kenya.
The crew has already covered 5 countries. 5 to go. The trip ends in Cape Town on December 17th. Mohammed Yusuf for VOA News, Nairobi.
And that is our show for today. From all of us here in Washington, me and our team, thank you very much for watching. Good night.
Welcome to the Voice of America's Newswords. This word is used in stories about your health.
Glaucoma. Glaucoma affects more than 70 million people around the world, according to the World Health Organization. People typically don't even know there's a problem until glaucoma has permanently destroyed much of their vision. In China and India, glaucoma is the second leading cause of blindness.
Glaucoma is an eye disease. It is one of the top causes of blindness in the world. It is irreversible. That means once a person has it, doctors cannot cure it.
Experts say a yearly eye exam is the best way to prevent glaucoma. Now, when you hear the word glaucoma, you will know what this newsword means.